Thanks for coming to the first of what I hope is going to be several IFAJ professional development webinars this year. Our goal has been to find ways to provide professional development opportunities for members all over the world, no matter where you are, whether you can come to a congress or a press tour or not. We're trying to bring professional development right to you wherever you may be. So this is exciting for us, and I have a special thank you for Allison Finnemore for making this happen and getting it set up. We have some basic rules. First, please mute your microphone. That keeps distractions minimal. Please don't share your webcam. So there's up at the top of the screen, you should have a tab that says webcams. So if you go onto that, if you just click off share my webcam, then that would really help. Janice, our presenter today, is going to answer questions at the end of her talk. So please type questions in to the chat box that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. And what we'll do is we'll collect those and make sure that they get asked at the end of the program. So it's a pleasure to introduce Janice Thoroughgood. She's going to tell you a bit about herself, but I can tell you she's a creative director, and an excellent one, for Farm Credit Canada in Regina, Saskatchewan in Canada. And she's going to talk to us about how she uses photos. So we talk a lot in photography about how to make photos, but it's really important to also know how to use them, how they're being used. You know, like we're always telling customers, grow for the market, grow what the market wants. We need to do the same as photographers. So Janice comes with a great deal of experience as an art director, creative director. She's got a degree in visual communication from Alberta College of Art and Design. She studied at the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland and the Falmouth College of Art in Cornwall in England. She's worked for TBWA Calgary, Venture Communications and AdFarm, all excellent agencies, ad agencies in Canada. And that all adds up to years of experience of using great photos and making them really work. So I'm really excited that we have Janice with us, and I look forward to her presentation. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. I'll just kick things right off. So that's me, and I'm standing in a dairy farm in Ontario. And that farm is pretty much all robotic. And so what I'm going to be talking about today, like Steve said, is not so much the technical side, but more the visual storytelling side. And for the first couple slides, I'm going to talk about me and kind of my journey and what led me to get where I am now. And then we'll get into the good stuff. Okay. So I live on my family's mixed grain farm just outside of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And to give you an idea about farms in our area, Saskatchewan is about 651,000 square kilometers. In that land area, there's only 1.164 million people, so it's pretty sparsely populated. Agriculture is one of our top 5 industries, and the average farm size is just over 1,600 acres. And right now we're in the middle of winter, and last week we had wind chills that lowered our outside temperature to minus 32 degrees Celsius with a risk of frostbite. So I would say wish you were here, but you probably don't want to be here right now. Our farm has been in our family since 1904, and that's 1 year before Saskatchewan became a province. Canada has provinces, the United States has states. For the prairies, that's considered to be a long time, and this photo was taken during threshing or harvest in the late 40s. And what's important to me outside of my family and friends is agriculture. So for me, as Steve mentioned, you know, I work for TBWA and stuff, but I wasn't working on clients I wanted to work on. I still wanted to work in agriculture. So some way I found my way back to agriculture, even though I went to Alberta College of Art and Design and Glasgow and that sort of thing. So for me, as a visual person, my top priority is to represent agriculture as the modern and progressive industry that it is. And this is important to me because there's a lot of people around the world that don't know a lot about agriculture, and there's a lot of bad and misleading information about there. So I just want to tell the best story that I can. So why am I showing a picture of me on a pony? This is a visual story, and sometimes an image can tell the whole story, and in this case, I can't. And me and the pony are there just for scale. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how advancements in farming is making a positive impact to the environment. So what looks like a grassy berm with trees on top is actually a pile of topsoil that accumulated during the 1930s Great Depression due to drought, wind, and soil erosion. And the prairies are typically flat, but you do see ridges similar to this where fence lines and tree rows collected dirt in the 30s. So that's a lot of dirt to blow around and pile up. We've had similar droughts since then, but thanks to the changes in farming practices, this doesn't happen anymore. Okay, so enough about me. On to photos, and I can't talk about a lot of the photos I'll be showing here today without a shout out to Greg Huzar, who is our FCC contracted photographer. And what I love about working with Greg is he's got a great eye, and he has an amazing skill to put people at ease, which is huge. And there's no limits for him to get a great shot. As you can see, he has no problem getting down the ground and getting dirty. This photo was taken at a field demonstration for drones in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago. And just a note on the photos I'll be sharing, some will be Greg's, some are mine, and some are from one of the IFAJ photo contests I judged a few years ago. So I'm going to be talking about the must-haves today, or a list of must-haves that I put together. And the first being focus. So if your picture isn't in focus, then it's not usable. You can't, Photoshop does a lot of stuff, but it can't add focus. So the entire photo doesn't need to be in focus, just your focal point. So here we've used selective focus or depth of field, which helps make the photo more engaging. It brings a healthy pig into the foreground, creates a focal point. It draws attention to, he's pretty darn cute. And by having the piglets in the background out of focus, it makes the photo less busy. And one thing to keep in mind when you're photographing animals, especially young ones, but any animals, especially if they're in a pen, is to try and not make it look like it's crowded. And this is another thing that people that don't work with animals a lot don't realize, that baby animals especially like to all huddle together. That's just what they do. But often that's perceived as pens that are too small, and that can get feedback and take you down a road that you weren't intending to go. Also, reflective focus on this is good because in Canada, we're moving towards not docking pigs' tails anymore, and you can kind of see in the background there's a couple tails showing, and they are actually docked. So I would say probably within the next year or so we wouldn't use this photo anymore, just because it doesn't meet current standards for the industry in Canada. In contrast, if you're doing a wider shot and you've got roomy pen, it's nice and clean, you'll want to have more things in focus. So this is a nice example of depth of field to bring attention to the subject. The light in the background, this is shot at the University of Saskatchewan in the greenhouse. So the light in the background is the natural greenhouse light, and it's just been, it's not in focus so that we can focus in on the student more. The student does have some fill light on her just to, you know, just to light her up a little bit nicer. And that backlight along her hair there is really nice too. Oops. Also, another example using depth of field to create a focal point. So there's a busy background, the back of somebody's head, which is great for context, but it doesn't really add a lot to the photo. So blurring that out is great. And also, this is something to keep in mind, and I'll mention again, if you look in her glasses, you can see there's a few people standing in the background. Always be aware of reflections happening in a photograph. I can't see the photographer, but it looks like there's a couple people with those same reflective shirts on back there. All right, second one is lighting. So photographing farmers in their environment is always preferred, and it's usually outside. So whenever possible, plan your shoot during non-peak sunlight hours because you want to avoid high contrast lighting. So this photo was taken at sunrise in the summer, so it was probably taken between 5 and 6 in the morning, and that's why we're getting such nice warm color tones there. And you have to be careful because there's a variety of things to light here. You want your sky to not be too blown out. There's still some information there. You can see some clouds and that sort of thing. Your background to be not too dark. And also there's some things like the equipment that's in the cab. If it was too bright out, it would start to get backlit and you wouldn't be able to see what's going on there. And also, of course, you want to have your subject well lit. And Steve was asking me yesterday if Greg used a flash on this one, and I wasn't there, but I'm going to say if he did use a small bit of fill light, it was very subtle and likely bounced because you can see the highlights like on her hoodie are still the warm tones from the sunrise. So he didn't drown out the natural light with his flash. So if it is really sunny, try putting the subject in the shade of a building or trees. So here, or if that's not possible, you can try, holding up a coat or an umbrella or something like that, just so you don't have people squinting into the sun or you're losing contrast. With the subject in the shade, you'll need to make sure the background doesn't get too blown out or bright. And this is something you can touch up in Photoshop as long as the contrast isn't too high. In this case, a shed shades the farmer while leaving the background brightly lit, but still with detail that can be adjusted in Photoshop if needed. Again, the sky on this one is a little bit light. And this is another example of using available light. So light coming through the window is creating a really nice backlight on the little girl and the cows that are watching her. So it's okay in this case that the light coming through the window is kind of blown out because that's a natural way to see it, and it's not a huge window. And it's creating really nice light along the cow and the little girl, and there's some on the floor there. With kids, just a reminder to keep farm safety in mind. In Canada, we follow the Canadian Agricultural Safety Association guidelines, and a basic guideline for kids is that they're not in an area where livestock could knock them down or kick them. Okay, resolution. So the third must-have is resolution, and for print, which I worked in a lot because I work in advertising, a photo must be 300 dots per inch at the size it's placed in the layout. So if your layout is 8 by 10 inches, it needs to be 300 dpi at 8 by 10 inches. Web only needs 72 dpi. So make sure you adjust your camera or phone to capture the maximum resolution possible. So to help us tell a visual story, art directors and designers like to have the ability to crop into a specific part of an image or to fit to a specific layout. So if the resolution is low, we can't zoom in and get what we want because the big picture isn't always the best part of the story or the most interesting part of the photo. We may also want a clear space where we can add text. So the top left photo, that bit of sky on the right, that's a really nice area to add some text in. Framing your images horizontally and vertically, so turning your camera, is always a good idea when taking photos because you never know what format your layout's going to be once you get to it. And with different social sizes too, like it's always a good idea to shoot horizontal and vertical. Also on this photo, if you look at the bins or silos, there's a little bit of lens distortion. You can see they're kind of tipping in towards the truck. That's a good thing to fix in Photoshop, just because you really have to watch for that sometimes, like fence posts and stuff like that really start to lean just straighten them out in Photoshop. Okay, composition. This is a big section, and I'm going to cover a few things, starting with the rule of thirds, and I'm going to contradict what I just said. So, as an art director, having space around the subject on all sides is great. However, if you're submitting a photo in a contest or a recommended crop to a publication, don't submit it like this. So the rule of thirds, like this, I mean by how this photo is right now. So the rule of thirds is basically a grid that breaks down your image into thirds. And following the rule of thirds, you create visual balance. Next time you're watching a movie or something, imagine you've got a piece of masking tape across the top third where the yellow line is on your screen. And that's where all the eyes are going to be on the screen throughout the show. Okay, so for this example, this is one of my photos. It's not super high quality. The subject's in the middle, which makes the image less interesting. And to make the photo more interesting, you want to place the subject close to where the vertical and horizontal lines intersect. And as a rule in landscape, your horizon should be along either the top third, the yellow line, or the bottom third, never in the middle. Also, compositionally, there's something cut off on the left-hand side that's distracting. And from a lighting standpoint, the sky's too bright and it's a bit blown out. And also, there's a variety of lines in the background created by the hills, which could lead the viewer's eye away from the focal point. If you're not familiar with grids and the rule of thirds, both Photoshop and Instagram have this exact same grid. And it's just good to go in and play around and see what different ways you can frame a photo. So to demonstrate the change in composition, I've just set up, I guess, some different, I'll call them stories. So this image is cropped differently, and by placing the subject in the foreground or the lower third, it creates more focus on the subject, and they have room to go forward into the picture, which suggests future or going forward. And by moving the subject to the top of the photo, the image becomes more daunting because the child is further away and you can't really see where she's going or what's in front of her. Also, the hills in the background have been cropped out, so the horse is the biggest thing in the photo, making it seem bigger than it did in the previous photo. This one you can see the foreground and the background, but the shadow's creating tension because it's so close to the edge of the image. And also it's a bit of a funny shape. You can still tell it's a horse, but it's not a normal shape for a horse. So when you have an image with a prominent shadow, the shadow is part of the picture and you need to consider it. So think, can you crop it out without it creating a line to lead your eye off the image? Or can you, or is it the more interesting part of the photo? Often, sometimes you get some really nice long shadows. That can be a great story too. Yeah, so just consider shadows when you're looking at your photo. And this crop makes the story more about the child. The shadow, for the most part, has been cropped out, and the horse is really more of an abstract shape. And again, just getting back to safety, this one doesn't meet Canadian guidelines because you can't see an adult in the photo, and the child should be wearing a helmet. This is my child, so. Next photo, same kid a few years later, and she has a helmet on this time, so I'm getting better. So this photo has a busy background, and generally I try to avoid a busy background, but in this case, the busyness is part of the story. So she's walking down a road which leads you to a rodeo. The trucks and trailers add to the context of a small town rodeo. And to make the story more about her, you could crop the horse's back legs out, but that would remove the horse's colorful boots that match her pants, which is a big part of the barrel racer lifestyle and adds to the story. In addition to the rule of thirds, I've added a second compositional element to consider, which is vanishing point. So vanishing point has been used since the Renaissance in their paintings to help create depth and to point to an important part of the story. So it helps to tell your story, because in this case it's pointing to a rodeo, so you're like, okay. And it typically works with the natural perspective lines on the horizon. So you'll see classic perspective photo is if you're standing in the middle of the road and the road just eventually goes into a V into the horizon. Okay, back to Greg's photos and another part of composition, which is viewpoint. So this is a nice harvest photo, and one thing I try to consider is, number one, my audience, and how can I make the photo more interesting. So for someone that isn't familiar with farming, this is a great photo. It's in a way, it's literal, and yeah, it's got all the elements you need, and you can understand what's going on. For someone in the industry, this photo uses less common vantage point and makes it more interesting. Again, if you look, you can see the lines of the rule of thirds in action there, which creates a dynamic and dramatic photo. And also the texture of the backlit chaff coming out the back of the combine is really nice. And this is a photo that you would need to clean your camera quite well afterwards, because you're going to have a lot of dust in there. So when you're taking pictures, look for a different vantage point and try to get, you know, at least 2 or 3 if you can. And you can easily do this, like, just consider, should I be standing? Should I be crouching? Should I lay on the ground like Greg was? And how do the different vantage points add to or change the story? Sometimes to get a good photo, you have to put yourself in places or positions that you wouldn't normally go, but my only ask is please be safe. So in this case, Greg is actually standing in the feed bunk, which is also getting a great response from the cow. And you can see the perspective lines pointing down the alley, which brings the farmer in, and he's looking that direction too. So it's a nice way to create a focused image. So this is an interesting photo to me because it shows the farmer's boots, which are quite iconic. He's in action, he's moving forward, and he's going to get some work done. Typically, when you shoot something from a low vantage point, it makes the subject seem more heroic, which I also like. One of my first jobs at AdFarm, the creative director told me my job was to make the farmer the hero, and I was like, I can do that. Okay, so shooting from above can also be an interesting perspective, and it's often used to make the subject seem smaller. In this case, it demonstrates how big the equipment is and gives some scale to all the detailed parts. And it wasn't hard to get this angle, it's just taken from up the cab of the combine. And as I mentioned in an earlier photo, texture can really add a lot to your photo. Just make sure it's adding and not distracting. And lay flat has also been a popular photo method recently. And just think of it as an option to show something from a different perspective. Maybe you want to show the different parts of something or the stages of something. Lighting is important, but it doesn't have to be shot in a studio. You can set anything up on just any flat surface. The only thing to keep in mind is the surface is part of the photo. Okay. So the next few photos, they're going to be from the IFAJ photo contest. And I'm just going to share some of the comments I made as a judge. Most are around cropping. Sometimes you'll be limited to how much you can actually crop an image for a contest because, again, they'll have a specific size, like it needs to be 8 by 10. So you can't crop it to 6 by 10, even though if that makes the photo look better. The vantage point on this photo is good. It's nice and low to the ground. My only thought is the sky is a little dark in contrast to the lighting in the foreground. And all I did for this one is just to bring focus down to the crop more and using the rule of thirds, I just crop some of the sky out and place the horizon along the top third of the photo. This is a nice photo, and a tricky one at that, because shooting a dark subject on a light background is always hard. There's detail in the horse. There's a couple of darker spots that you could maybe use a reflector or something, but then again, you are photographing an animal and it might not stand for that. The snow, there's detail in the snow in the background, which is also not the easiest thing to do. And sorry, I'm just lost in my notes here. Oh, and it's okay that the focus is in the background, because it is quite a busy background, so it's nice to have that texture there, but blur it back a bit. Compositionally, you could crop out the evergreen on the top right. It's a little bit distracting because it's the only thing that's got a lot of color in the photo, but overall it's good. So this shows the evergreen cropped out, but then once I did that, I noticed there's a fence post right against the right edge of the photo, and that's creating some visual tension. Also, the width of the snowy field is the same as the horse's head, which is causing a negative space where your eye gets stuck, because it just bounces back and forth when you've got two equal spaces like that. So I just pulled the side in just a little bit more and made the field a bit narrower, and now we've achieved better balance, and your eye just naturally flows around the horse's head now. So photographing animals is always tricky, and they don't always cooperate, and in this situation there's more than one and they're on the move, so this is hard. So the animals are well lit in this photo. There are some distracting elements. There's the shadows that we talked about before. Unfortunately, there's a tire track that's on the road that, of course, you can't do anything about. The goat's ear is overlapping the cow's nose, and because they're the same color, it's a little distracting there. The goat's udder, or I'm not sure if that's an udder, is sticking out the bottom, and that's another little distraction. And also the cow has something hanging out of its mouth, which is also something you can't control. And then also the background noses and legs, that's also distracting. So for this one, I would try, if you can, a different vantage point. And I know you've got animals on the move, so that might not be an option. But if you took a couple steps to the left, perhaps you could shoot across them, and you have to be careful because, again, these guys are on the move. If you took a lower vantage point, could you maybe just shoot feet or shoot up on them? It looks like there's some green grass in the background. Maybe you want to run around behind them and shoot from the back and show where they're going. Just some different vantage points you could possibly do. I like the bell on the goat's neck, though. That's cool. This is a nice image, and it's well lit, and the focus is on the bees is sharp. You could crop slightly to remove some of the darker flowers in the background that lead the eye away. The bees are still in the middle, but in this case, that's okay, because it's obvious this image is about the bees. And when we talk about lines, the petals of the flower create lines that lead you into the photo and create a nice frame for them. So this is a great vantage point. They're sitting on either the cab of the truck or standing on the side of the box. And the lines created by the truck box and the auger create some really nice visual interest. There's some nice light just from the combine coming down on the grain coming out. And from a quality standpoint, anytime you take a photo in the dark, you are going to lose some photo quality just because it's dark and your camera's not capable of getting as much information as if you were in a regular daylight. So for this one, by cropping the light out on the front of the cab, more attention is drawn to the focal point of the grain dumping. And I also slightly cropped a bit of the sky out from the top of the image. I like silhouettes and the colors in this photo. And again, this is another one because of low light, there's a little bit of photo information lost, but it's still a really nice image. You could play around with cropping to create some variations, but overall it's a nice photo. I like how there's varying degrees of darkness of the silhouettes as the cows go off in the distance. So lighting here is good, and there's no strong shadows or highlight. And people are a challenge to photograph. They get nervous, and it's really up to you to make them comfortable and capture them in their environment. And it seems once you start taking some photos of them, they will generally relax a little bit. So sometimes you just need to be patient. The farmer in this picture looks pretty relaxed. He is squinting quite a bit, but that might just be his natural smile. It doesn't look like it was too bright or anything like that. A different vantage point could add some interest. So the equipment that he's leaning against has got lots of lines and things on it. So you could go on the other side of the equipment and have him turn around and shoot across the equipment at him, or maybe go up and go up the ladder of the tractor and again shoot down across the equipment onto him. Have him doing something with the equipment, or maybe something that shows scale if it's a really big piece of equipment. And because he's not out in a field right now, he's parked on grass, you could also maybe try cropping, doing some different cropping and that sort of thing. Just play around with it. Oops. This image has some interaction in it, which is nice, and the vantage point is down on the ground. Depending on your story, you may want to adjust your focal point. In this picture, the plants and soil are in focus and the people are slightly out of focus. So again, playing around with bracketing. Do you want them in focus in the foreground out of focus, or vice versa? If you want to focus on the crop and soil, you could get a little bit lower to the ground and just to get more information about what's going on in the ground there. And cute kids can be a challenge to photograph. There's some really good expressions here. The main thing I'd point out on this image is the background. Always try and check to see what's going on in your background. In this case, there's a staircase that's really distracting. So if you rotated the kids and the camera slightly to the right or left, was the background less busy? What about sitting the kids on the stairs or laying on the grass? Like you could lay them down the grass and stand above them. Play an experiment, and always don't just take one photo. And I know your time is limited when you've got 3 kids to take a picture of. And finally, you don't always have to show people to tell a story about them. This is a nice way to show a family and give a bit of story about who they are and what they do. And you don't have to deal with 4 people and trying to get them all in their best light. So thank you very much for having me as a guest. I hope you have a couple of takeaways, and if you have any questions or feedback, I think we have some time.
Well, thank you, Janice. This is great. I know I, for one, will probably start carrying an umbrella in my kit, because that's a really cheap and clever way to introduce shadow or shade when sometimes we're not anywhere near anything we can stand under. So that I love a lot of these ideas on reflections and shadows and equal space. We do have some questions. There was a question from Yasara in Sri Lanka asking how to select a good lens.
Oh, I don't know if I'm the best person to ask on that. I think you have to look at each situation though, because as I mentioned with those bins or silos, you can, if your lens is too wide, I believe, and this is where my knowledge is limited, you're going to start to get that fisheye effect, and as soon as you fisheye a person, it doesn't look good, and yeah, you really need to make sure your lens isn't changing your photo, if that helps.
That makes a lot of sense. It looks like you also really like the wide f-stop, that large f-stop on the open end that allows the photographer to blur the background out while keeping one element in focus.
Yeah, yeah, and we do that a lot. I mean, it's partly a control, like I said, with the pigs. You know, when you're walking into this is somebody's business. It's also their home for them usually, and not everybody's yard or operation is perfect. So if you can use that to simplify your photo and create a focus, that's a really good thing to take advantage of.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, another question from Ali was, for commercial photography, is it ever preferred to shoot film over digital?
I don't know anybody that shoots film anymore. I think, and we even have people now that are shooting on video on RedCam and pulling stills off of that. So I would say digital.
And RedCam, that is the that's a video camera, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Ali had another question. When using flash, is it ever beneficial to use color gels, or is this better done in in post-production?
Yeah, we don't use much for gels or anything like that. Again, we want to keep colors as natural as possible. And before Greg gives us his photos, he does run them all through a filter. But yeah, we don't add a lot of color or anything like that onto the raw photo.
Got it. Now, is that an ethics thing, or is that just an issue of practicality?
Well, I think it's a couple things. One, I realize that some photographers like to use gels and stuff like that, but when you're shooting for a company, you have to consider their brand, and the colors and gels might not suit the brand of their photography. So it's better to give, to me, the more natural a photo as possible, and then if the art director wants to go in later and add some, I've added grain and texture to photos. I've changed them to sepia tones. I changed them to black and white. So it just really depends what I want to do with the photo afterwards. And that is an opinion of an art director. It's like, I want to do what I want to do to the photo.
So our job as photographers is to do the best job we can, but give you the room to do your job as well.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great.
And many art directors do work with a Photoshop artist as well, depending on what they're creating with the photo.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go a little bit out of order because you mentioned Photoshop, and Jacqueline asked, should a photographer always allow Photoshop editing? And if so, what are the boundaries? So how much can the photographer influence that, and how much should the photographer ask or demand when it comes to manipulation of his or her picture?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I would hope that if an art director or an agency comes to you and requests a photo, they should be upfront in telling you what they want and what they're going to do with it. However, if you have a photo and they've seen it and they want it, I think you have the total right to say, okay, what exactly are you going to do with it? Because we've all seen ads where things are photoshopped and or just a piece of a photo is taken and that kind of thing. So that's a total right as a photographer to be inquisitive and find out what they're going to do with your photo.
That's so staying along that same line of questioning, Myrna up there in Canada says, I shoot more for news, so along the same lines as Rebecca. how much manipulation is okay?
That's a good, hi Myrna, that's a good question. When it's for news, and we're similar here at Farm Credit Canada, we want to show the real industry, so not a lot of photo manipulation. Like what I would recommend is try and get the best shot you can. So look at your vantage point, look at use your rule of thirds, look at perspective lines and what's going on in the background, and get the best photo you can. I'm just trying to think of things that, and I don't know for news, like we used to Photoshop the numbers off of cows' ear tags and that sort of thing, but we don't do that anymore. And really, I don't think you would want to change too much outside of cropping and maybe correcting some lens distortion and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing you mentioned. You used to Photoshop out the ear tag numbers, and now you don't. So what do you? First of all, why did that change, or what prompted you to change that?
At one point, we were told, well, if somebody sees that ear tag, they can identify who that cow belongs to. But since then, we've heard, well, that's not really that big of a concern for what we're doing with it. And you'll see, like if you go to a photo stock library, that kind of thing will be photoshopped out, which is what holds us back from using stock a lot of times, because any identifying tags are photoshopped out, logos are photoshopped off of equipment, which farmers catch stuff like that in a second. And they're like, why is there no logo? Where's the John Deere logo on that tractor? Like, they just notice stuff like that. So to be authentic to our audience, we can't do that. It's not something that they tolerate, really.
That's interesting. So what do you started to allude to what you felt were appropriate things, like, you know, correcting for lens distortion.
Mm-hmm.
What are appropriate alterations that one can make and still be considered within the bounds of ethics, or not changing the photo?
Well, I'm just thinking, sorry. Some for us, and again, sorry, I don't have as much experience with the media, but things we'll do is we'll, try and clean up a cow, because cows lay in poop. So we'll try and clean up a cow if it's got poop on its leg or something like that. I don't think that's unethical to do that. I think it's just, making your photo a little bit nicer. And again, if you've got a pasture and there's a grassy spot and a spot that's just dirt, try and take pictures on the grassy spot, because again, it just looks nicer. I wouldn't go in and Photoshop anything out of the photo. Like the photo we're looking at right now, I wouldn't go in and Photoshop anything out of there, because I don't think that's right. Like, for example, okay, one thing, I thought of something now, sorry, that's a hard question. One thing that we do receive a lot of feedback on is, and I'm not sure outside of Canada, but in Canada, a lot of dairy cows are still chained. And of course, that's something that a lot of animal rights activists don't like. So sometimes you'll see some photos where the chains have been photoshopped out. And to me, that wouldn't be ethical or true. If you're in a dairy farm reporting on something in that, especially that specific dairy, and you take a picture of a cow that's chained, I think you have to show that picture, because that is the reality of what it is.
I think this could be a really fascinating discussion to look at across different media and different countries, different cultures, different expectations. That may be a really good IFAJ conversation. We'll have to try to figure out how to keep that conversation going. So thank you, Janice, for kicking that part off. That's you've started us down, I think, what'll be an interesting road.
Well, and it's of interest to me too, because it's really hard to even keep up because things are changing so fast here because of consumer demand. It's something we really have to try and keep top on. We're always checking with subject matter experts to say, okay, is this still okay? Is this flooring in this pig pen still okay? Do we still do this? Do we still do that? Because things are changing so fast right now.
That is, it is definitely an industry in constant change. Now, I want to go back. You mentioned cows, and Luis from Brazil had mentioned that he does a lot of photography of animals, cows, horses, that kind of thing. Do you have any magic to keep them in a good position? Patience, noises, and I know you come from a dairy environment, so I figure maybe you are exactly the person to ask.
No. In general, I find cattle, especially if they're pasture cattle, they'll just stand and stare at you. So if you want a picture of a cow not staring at you, good luck. But yeah, photographing babies and animals is like, take lots of photos. Like sometimes when we go out on a shoot with Greg, he'll shoot up to 1,000 photos. And the question on film is, you obviously do not want to be shooting film if you're shooting up to 1,000 photos.
That's a good point. That's pixels are free, but film is expensive.
Right. Just make sure you got a second battery for your camera.
Exactly. So now, when shooting, and Callistus from Africa had asked a really interesting question. Is it okay for you as an art director if a photographer is shooting on one of the new phones, like a Samsung or an iPhone, that kind of thing?
We haven't had that scenario where we've hired a photographer to do that. We will, like, I'll take some photos on my phone, or I've taken video on my phone before that we might use for social, but I can't say we've ever paid anyone for someone to shoot. And it's not to say we won't, because phones are getting to a place where they can shoot just as good as some of the cameras, or almost just as good.
That's I know in my own work I've actually published some shots that I've just snapped on the phone because that's all I had with me, and they've actually run and look pretty decent. So I think, Callistus, there is hope that and the photography is, or the cameras are getting better.
Yeah.
There is more room for more questions. Yasira was asking some questions about sort of the mechanics of lenses, and I've offered to connect her with some other information that'll be a good background for that. But if people have other questions as well, we'll be happy to share those. I was going to ask, while we're waiting for other questions, Janice, can you describe what makes just an ideal photo for you to work with? When you sit down at your desktop and you go, this is gonna be a good day because this photo is giving me what I need. What is it that has really made a particular image? If you think of an image that was really compelling for you, what made that work for you?
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, having space to work with. So like the image that I've got up on my thank you screen right now, I can crop it a variety of ways. I can crop it horizontal, I can crop it vertical, because you know, when we create a piece, we might create a magazine ad, so that's vertical, and then some tweets, and those are horizontal, and maybe HTML email, so we'll need an image for that. And you know, there's some space down on the bottom right of this. I can throw some copy in there if I want to. It's just having room to work within the photo, because and even working with Greg, sometimes he'll take a great photo, but he's gone in and cropped it the way he thinks it should be cropped, and not to say that it's wrong, but then, you know, for some ads you need bleed, which is like outside of the ad space. Sometimes you need up to 3/4 of an inch around the ad, because the publication just wants that extra safety when they're printing it. And it's like, if that's not there, then I can't use that picture. So, and I was going to add to the question about shooting on phones. Sometimes when we're producing a video or something like that, it's nice to have the option, like we did a video back when I was at AdFarm, and we actually got an old Super 8 camera and we shot some of it on Super 8 just to it added grit into it actually, and it just, again, that whole texture thing. So don't throw away your old cameras either. There's
and it's interesting that you mentioned grit, because we had a question that just came in from Suzanne, who asked, can you offer some suggestions on how to shoot in low light, adjustments we can make on the camera? I find if I go higher on ISO, I get too much noise.
Again, I'm not the best for knowing the workings of the camera. Like, I have done photography, but that's not my strength, that's for sure. Yeah, I don't think I could. Sorry, I can't help with that.
So I'm gonna turn that question a little bit. As an art director, do you like to see a little bit of noise and texture and grit, or do you really like to see something that's super tight in its resolution and its sharpness?
Well, you can always add grit. It's kind of like focus. You can always take away focus, but you can't add it back in. Personally, as an art director, yes, I do like grit. For FCC's brand, we're not a gritty brand. We're very clean. We're a financial institution, right? So grit is not our thing. But and again, that's knowing your audience and what they kind of want.
That makes a lot of sense. Marisa had asked, to what extent or speed is video taking over from photos in the agri-media space?
Well, video is definitely growing. In Canada, unfortunately, we are still on limited internet access. So videos, there's out where I live, sometimes you can't even use your cell phone to make a phone call because there's just not, the towers aren't there. So video takes up a whole lot more memory. So I would say it's coming. And I also think things like AI and where they're going to start creating instructions on how to change a part on a combine, that's going to be a video from now on. That is no longer going to be, and there's the whole thing out there of, do you even get to fix your own combine anymore? But I can see a lot more videos, instructional videos and that sort of thing, which producers will like.
So we need to all brush up, not just on our still techniques, but on our video techniques.
Yeah.
Do you find the same concepts of good composition apply to video as they do to still photos?
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, like some videos are even being shot vertically now, which I don't know, maybe I'm just old and set in my ways, but I'm like, well, that's weird. But yeah, for sure. Rule of thirds works the same way. Focal point, all that kind of thing.
That makes sense. There's a note here from Myrna. It's just making sure in case people can't see it. She says, FYI, right now all my published photos are taken on my Samsung Galaxy phone, and they're published in print and in magazines in Canada. And my phone is economical. So phone cameras can also be used on manual, which is it's interesting. I guess I never really realized that. To be able to use them on manual. So you have that artistic control then.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of those phones, like I use an iPhone, so I'm not as familiar with the Samsung, but I would say for media, for sure, because a lot of them aren't looking for the super high resolution either. But from what I've heard, a lot of those phones have that resolution now too.
Well, we've got a lot to do and a lot to apply, but I really appreciate your bringing this insight to us, Janice, and showing us what you look for as a user of the photography. That's I think going to be useful to many of us, and I keep seeing very nice compliments in the chat box. So what we're going to do now is we're going to you'll see a survey come into your email box. Please fill that out. It'll ask you for your impressions of what Janice has presented today, but then also it'll ask what you'd like to see in the future. So as I mentioned at the top of the call, we'd like to expand this webinar program and deliver professional development topics that are relevant to folks in the field. So please let us know what you'd like to see webinars on, and we'll try to make them happen. This webinar will also be shared on the IFAJ website, where people can access it whenever they like. So please share it around, let your colleagues know, and come back and look for more in the year to come. Again, I wanted to thank Allison Finnemore for arranging this and introducing us to Janice. Want to thank Norma at the Global Office for making the webinar happen in the first place and doing all the magic behind the scenes to connect us all. And I really deeply want to thank Janice Thoroughgood for being with us this morning and sharing her insight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon at another webinar.